to business.
That's the nectar of the gods, baby.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the #1 liquid-fueled, liquid-lubricated show on the interwebs. This is the Whiskey Musings broadcast. I am your patriotic cowboy hat-wearing host, Rick. So tonight, I want to talk a little bit about some of the revelations that have occurred this past week, and I got to be honest with you. I'm kind of shocked. I'm a bit flabbergasted. And yes, I am having a little bit of a difficult time putting my thoughts into words, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. I mean, considering the fact that I've, got to be able to do this as the host. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about, and bring to mind something that's kind of interesting. I've always been on the hunt. I've always been on the lookout for unique whiskey gifts. Obviously it's Whiskey Musing, so I've got to have something, to kind of throw out. But a while ago, my son turned me on to this subscription-based service called Bespoke Post, and that's BESPOKEPOST.com. Check it. Feel free to check it out. They are not a sponsor of the program. I am not getting anything monetarily out of this. All of this stuff that you are about to see was purchased by yours truly. But one of the things that I am on the lookout for, I'm always watching for, is unique gifts that are centered around whiskey. And one of the things that I had for this month's Bespoke Post shipment, which is basically a box of things. They base it off of your interests that you tell them about. And this week I got an interesting little group here of whiskey themed items. One of them here being, and if you're watching on the YouTube channel, if you can see this, but if you're on the audio, I'll tell you about it. So one of them is bourbon-infused toothpicks from a company called Daneson, Daneson. And bourbon-infused toothpicks. And this was kind of cool. It comes in a really, really neat package. And it has, some nice little tubes inside with several toothpicks in each tube. And it's really, they're supposed to, according to the directions, you're supposed to enjoy them as soon as the cork is popped. So that was the first thing. The second one, which this is actually the one that really piqued my interest, was the Field Guide. This is a book. It's called The Field Guide, and I'm trying to get it right here for the YouTubers. A Field Guide to Whiskey. And this book is by Hans Offinga, and I apologize if I butcher your name, but it basically is supposedly an expert compendium to take your passion and knowledge to the next level. And they've got several chapters. I mean, it's a beautiful book. It's bound. I won't say leather bound. It's not leather bound, but it's paper bound, and it's got the gilded edges on the pages. But some of the contents in here are, it discusses what whiskey is. It discusses whiskey around the world. It discusses how to taste whiskey, from grain to glass. I mean, there's several different things here. Talks about whiskey trends, whiskey trivia. So I look forward to digging into this book in the near future, and I'll probably be bringing a few things onto the show with regards to it. Now, the other thing that they sent me, another part of this, was they sent me a glass, a couple of glasses. I had a choice of either buying, basically 2 or 4. I chose 2. So it's essentially a rocks glass. It's kind of fancy in it. But if you'll notice, there's something in the middle. If you're watching on YouTube, there's something in the middle. It's a big, huge, literally a ball of ice. And as a part of it, they sent these molds. They are plastic molds that you pour water into, stick it in your freezer, and it creates a 2.5 inch, 2 to 2.5 inch ball of ice for your drink instead of using crushed ice, because apparently the ball of ice doesn't melt quite as fast in your drink. So therefore, the thought process is that you use this ball instead of crushed ice, and you get less water in the alcohol, to do it. So realistically, if you happen to hear me say something along the lines of, "Hey, I've got a big ball in my cup," well, now you'll know what I'm talking about, not necessarily the other you dirty-minded people you. Anyway, so I thought that was kind of cool. I thought I'd go ahead and bring it up again. That is the place that I ordered it, and pretty much what they do is they kind of do a conglomeration of getting a bunch of things together and they put it in a box for you. It's a subscription-based service. It's called Bespoke Post, BESPOKE.com, bespokepost.com. And they're not affiliated with the program. I purchased all of these items. I just thought it was kind of neat, a unique gift for the whiskey lover in your family or friend or whatever it is that you want. But hey, while you're going around and taking a look at websites, why don't you stop by the Whiskey Musings Logo Gear store at store.whiskeymusings.online. Whiskey Musings, all one word, .online. And I would appreciate it because, obviously the proceeds from any sales of any of the apparel or stickers, phone cases, t-shirts, tank tops, sweatshirts, all of that stuff goes directly to the program. So I appreciate that and your support of that program. Of that program to support this program. Anyway. All right. So, tonight I kind of want to talk about some revelations happened this week. And I don't know if anybody's, maybe you're kind of dry on politics. I mean, I totally get it. You're kind of dry on politics and stuff. And, I would be too. However, we need to make sure that we keep our toe in the pool, per se. We need to make sure that we keep our eyes on the prize. We watch these people to understand what is going on within our government. And I'm not talking about, just Democrats. You also have Democrats, Republicans, you have independents. They all, in my mind, they all have problems because as a famous quote that's running around out there is power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we need to take a look at what's going on, especially in today's world. Now, last week we did talk a little bit about some things that were going on. And I'll be honest with you in terms of conservatism, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not even really all that thrilled about any of the Republican candidates either. I kind of made that kind of sort of clear. There are a few rising stars that I am paying attention to, but those people are realistically few and far between as far as politics goes. But one thing that I did want to bring up is here this week, there was an announcement in regards to the Arizona election audit. Now, for those of you that may not know, Arizona, Maricopa County in particular, decided to do a audit of all of their ballots to make absolutely 100% certain as to what was the real numbers, because there has been, definitely some things running around, and a lot of the people out there are saying that it's a conspiracy theory. I personally, I do believe there is irregularities that do need to be investigated. I don't know if anything is really big enough to make a change. However, that being said, an interesting meeting happened down in Arizona, and the one of the organizations that's doing this audit is called Cyber Ninjas. And they went in front of a Senate committee down in Arizona, and they were talking about the elections and where, what they found so far. This is preliminary. The final report is supposed to be coming out here in a few weeks, possibly even into the first part of August. But supposedly in a testifying mode, and there's video of this out there. I pulled this up off of Tucson.com, which is the local news outlet down in Tucson. But apparently, the Cyber Ninja CEO said there was somewhere in the realm of 74,243 mail in ballots that were received that they quote, where there is no clear record of them being sent, end quote. Now, the interesting thing about this is that apparently in Arizona, the way that this works is they have a tally sheet of basically every time they send a ballot out, and then when they receive it back, they essentially track that, yes, the ballot went out, and yes, that same ballot came back. And apparently there doesn't seem to be a record within the system that they have, whether it's electronic or paper, that, 74,000 plus were actually sent out. Now, he does mention that, this is possibly a clerical error. He does not claim that this is, 100% for sure election fraud or any of that stuff. But he does mention, though, that there was also 11,326 individuals who did not show up on the version of the voter rolls that were prepared by the day after the election, but they did show up on a December 4th list as not only being registered, but also having been voted or having voted already. And then he also mentioned that they have an irregularity showing that nearly 4,000 people are listed as registering to vote after the cutoff of October 15th. Now, the key thing about this is not so much that this stuff is occurring. It's just the fact that, Arizona supposedly, went for Biden, and the electoral votes went for Biden, but the margin is less than some of these discrepancies that you see. In fact, I think the margin was somewhere between 10,000 to 11,000 votes that went for Biden, instead of going for Trump, as an example. Now, realistically, I don't think, I'm still kind of in the camp where if this stuff happened and if this stuff is widespread, we definitely need to try and dig to get to the bottom of it. But do I think it really makes a big difference in the grand scheme of things? Because we do have, Biden in office, Kamala Harris is in office. And honestly, even from a constitutional standpoint, we are in completely blind, brand new, spanking new waters with this. There is nothing in the Constitution that gives us any kind of a guideline as to where we go from here. This is all brand new territory. And so anything that gets decided is basically going to be all brand new, because realistically, the founding fathers didn't really think that this could get this way. So, we don't have a roadmap to try and fix this, whatever this might even be. But the funny thing about it is that in terms of conspiracy theories, everybody was talking about how, yeah, the vote was bad, so on and so forth. And I'll be honest with you, living in Washington State, I know that we've had some close call elections, in recent history, since I've been here. And it begs the question, though, that if we're finding these kinds of issues, that, maybe potentially each state needs to kind of clean up its own scenarios in order to try and get to the point where people will ultimately feel like they are, like they're not being disenfranchised, that their vote counts. And I'll be honest, with the grand scheme of things, I mean, just on this particular topic, voting for something like the presidency, I mean, we're talking, 300 million or 180 million, whatever the number actually is, of people who are voting. So my one vote probably isn't going to make a difference. But where it does make a difference is here locally. It makes a difference in places like going for your school board, for, whoever is your mayor or your city councils, or even could potentially go to, your state legislature, your governor. that's really where the impact is being felt. Not only that, but things like you know, uh, initiatives here in Washington. We have initiatives. Things like budget constraints for the schools, school board bonds, things of that nature. That's where it really makes a difference. That's where it really counts. And so having something like this that even just remotely presents a possibility of a potential issue, and especially one that seems to be fairly widespread or wide a big scale. If it was only a few hundred or something like that, I could understand. But we're talking, 74,000 plus people, ballots that could be an issue. This is where everyone who is in the camp that the election was nefarious is coming from. And the funny thing about it is that, the way that Arizona's been handling its audit, it's been taken note by several other states across the nation. And one of them in particular, of course, is Georgia. Now, Georgia is having its own audit going on. Georgia has the audit from voterga.org. They are doing it, and their analysis came out a couple days on the heels of the Arizona scenario. And the the funny thing is that they actually are suggesting that the error based on a look at just Fulton County, and Fulton County, I believe, encompasses the city of Atlanta. So they're looking at Fulton County only, and they found enough that extrapolates to a potential of error reporting. And by error reporting, meaning ballots that can't be read by the machines or have issues and that kind of stuff, is up to a whopping 60% of ballots that came back very well could have been, changed or modified or done something different with. And, it's not simply just a case of errors. They also found that there were falsified tally sheets. Now, granted, they only found 7 of them, but the funny thing is that there was enough. Again, it's just the mere appearance of impropriety that makes everyone of a typically critical nature question. But what essentially the falsified tally sheet showed was that there were a couple of tally sheets that they took a look at that they were reported as being 100% for Biden, and 0 for Trump. But yet when they went through and actually counted the ballots again, they found more of like a 60-40 split, rather than the 100-0 split. And so, it's things like this that causes the average American who pays attention to this stuff a bit of a conundrum for us, because one of the things that, Americans like myself generally want to believe is we want to believe that our election system is above board and that there isn't things that are going on. And granted, again, these could be legitimate errors. I'm not saying that. This could be just a clerical issue. I'm not saying it is focused on fraud. But having something that big occur within our election system brings into question how many more places are like this. If we have errors like this in just a couple of spaces, what about other places like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or some of these other places? And that actually brings up the next piece, which is that Wisconsin's they've been to Arizona. The Wisconsin legislature has sent people to Arizona, been looking at the audit, and now there's a couple of legislative representatives in Wisconsin who are calling for an audit of their own. You know, this is the thing. If you're a red-blooded American, you really ought to look at things like this and be concerned. It's not that it actually is like a concerted effort or a specialized effort to undermine our democracy, But it does beg the question, what is going on? There are some things, it might not even be, it could just be circumstantial. It could just be, the fact that the things happened, there was a lot of stuff going on with COVID and everything else. But the question, it does beg the question. And what's even worse is when you get people like the Democrat Party, who has hired lawyers to go to Arizona and fight this in court, to the Department of Justice to go after Georgia, when Georgia is like, hey, you know what? We know things are kind of, they were a little funky. We're going to go ahead and we're going to shore this up by, creating a new law, voter law. And they're going to get, they're having a lawsuit brought by the Department of Justice. It's stuff like this that makes you think. It makes you wonder, what exactly is going on? What is it that these people are really trying to hide? Just because of the fact that they are trying to, push around and legalese their way into a point where none of this stuff can be discovered. And so that's kind of the main piece of this particular conspiracy theory in terms of regards to our voting. And our voting being the most secure, which is what it was purported to be. And what's really funny is that just, back in 2016, the Democrats were just talking all kinds of stuff about Russian collusion, that there was no way that Trump could have gotten in without help. And so, honestly, hey, I would have been just fine with a complete audit back then in 2016. I'm completely fine with an audit right now, because of the plain and simple fact is I do want to trust in the fact that when I send my ballot in, that it is actually counted, it is taken care of appropriately, and it is all legal and above board. That's honestly what we really want to be pushing toward. Okay. Now, another thing that came out this week. So that's kind of enough on the election piece, but another thing that happened this week, which again, this is something that should give you pause. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% going on, but Biden did a press conference, and in that press conference, he talked about going door to door to get people vaccinated for COVID. Okay. Now, the funny thing about it was that all of those people who were talking about going door to door, the White House then, after he made that statement, and that is a literal direct quote, was that he wanted to go door to door. Okay. But after that statement, the White House kind of backed off a little bit, and they're like, oh, no. We're not going to trace you. We're not going to track vaccine you. We're not going to do any of that stuff. And actually there's nobody that's going door to door. Okay. The government is not going to go door to door. That's what they say. Well, in North Carolina, shortly thereafter, it was discovered that North Carolina actually does have a program that is going door to door. The program is, it's a county, I believe, in North Carolina. It's called Doses to Doors. And they have mobile vaccination vehicles. Now, granted, this is to make it more accessible to people. Okay. To make the vaccine accessible. So I'm not trying to claim that this is, something that they're going to start tracking people who aren't vaccinated kind of scenario, or, mark down who didn't, come to the door or whatever, but they could. I mean, the possibility is there. It wouldn't take much for them to have a list of all of the addresses in a particular neighborhood and mark off ones that did not respond to them knocking on the door or responded negatively. So the step is there. The question is whether or not you trust that you are not going to have that information passed on. And that's kind of an interesting thought process, but it's not just in North Carolina where this has happened. I've actually found another place up in, let me find it here. Wisconsin, Milwaukee. The city of Milwaukee has actually already launched such a door-to-door vaccination check effort. And they're looking to improve upon Milwaukee County's numbers, because apparently only about roughly 48.7 is what's been reported, have actually received at least one of the COVID-19 vaccinations. So, you know, this whole concept that he basically threw out there, that Biden threw out there, is actually kind of coming true. There are places within the country that are doing door-to-door vaccination drives. And it isn't that big. It's not that big of a step to go from vaccination drives to tracking people to figure out who doesn't have the vaccine versus who does. Now, we've had a lot of conversations in the last several months that have been about vaccination passports and making it so that, hey, if you're not vaccinated, then you can't do all of these wonderful things. And there's places there's places like ballparks and some public venues and things like that that have gone so far as to publicly announce that they are going to have vaccinated sections and unvaccinated sections. And so the question actually becomes, wait a minute. First of all, that is, I mean, rightfully so, that's an invasion of somebody's privacy if you ask them if they've been vaccinated or not. And that is counterintuitive to our system of beliefs in terms of freedom and free will and everything else. I'm going to be honest with you. If you feel like you need to be vaccinated, go get vaccinated. I mean, there's a lot of people that have gotten vaccinated. There's been, I think it's close to 65% or something across the US that have all been vaccinated. Go and get vaccinated. If you feel like you have to get vaccinated, get vaccinated. But the brilliant part about freedom in this world is that we have the choice. We should have the choice because, again, even though this particular virus can be particularly deadly to some, it's not deadly to all. In fact, the numbers that we have now after dealing with this thing for like a year and a half have shown that we're looking at a 99% plus survivability rate. And, that plus kind of changes. Okay. But again, it goes back to the whole idea of this is a dangerous game that the government is playing in terms of things like vaccine passports, tracking people, stuff like that. And to be honest with you, I actually I really do blame the whole idea of the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act back when 9/11 happened, 9/11 was horrific and everything else, but I think a lot of people bought into the idea that, hey, we need to start tracking these people and we need to start doing things. We need to start protecting ourselves, which is noble causes, completely noble causes. And I'll be honest with you, back then I was kind of on the fence and I was like, well, we'll kind of have to see what happens. But then you have, Tucker Carlson as an example, like I said last week, where he talked about how the NSA, he's gotten credible evidence from a credible source who has produced, um, uh, statements that he has personally made in communications that normally shouldn't be tracked that have popped up in a NSA tracking thing. And so, we have to sit and scratch our heads and wonder what in the heck is going on. I mean, this is truly getting into more of the deeper delves on both Animal Farm and 1984 and some of the things that we've been warned about. And it's not just that. It's not just government tracking. It's now government is admittedly watching over our social media. I mean, just this week, Jen Psaki made a comment about how the White House is actually flagging people now and flagging posts, not people, but posts right now. They're flagging them for what they're considering misinformation about the COVID-19 situation. And so you have to, and they even actually broke it down. She actually broke it down to there's like 12 or 13 individuals who are spreading this misinformation on COVID, and that it comprises up to 65% of the posts that they're seeing. These 12 or 13 people or whatever the number is, I mean, it's a very small number, but these people are the ones that are spreading this disinformation. And the question has to be asked. I mean, in terms of like conspiracy theories and that, the question has to be asked. What is it that they are going to qualify as disinformation? Misinformation, not disinformation. Disinformation is something different, but misinformation. And that's the question that you have to ask yourself. You have to sit here and question, okay, wait a minute. If they're doing something, I mean, you know, the First Amendment prevents government from stopping your speech. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you are not controlled by other sources. An example of which is if I'm wearing my company's uniform, okay, I work at a company and I'm wearing my company's uniform and I go out and go to a political rally or something that the company itself doesn't stand for, okay, I can get into trouble from the company because what I've essentially done is by de facto wearing their uniform or their logo, I have de facto stated that that company stands for whatever it might be that I might be protesting. I mean, it could be anything. It could be, it doesn't even matter. Or if I go to, let's say, a bar or something and get into a bar fight wearing company logoed shirts, I could potentially get disciplined for that or even fired. I mean, that is possible. And I've discussed this before when dealing with sports figures and stuff. I do think that, for an example, sports figures, they really need to be careful in terms of what they do because they're actually representing the teams. But at the same time, though, we also need to understand that having the government watch over our social media accounts, I mean, there's already a security risk. I mean, people, I've gone through this before. There's already a security risk. If you post things online, you have to go with the assumption that that is a public forum, that it's not going to be protected in any way, shape, or form. Okay, period. Like this video. I could get called on the carpet for what I am saying to you and about the products and services that I'm talking about. I could get called on the carpet for this. And that is a risk that I am taking by presenting this in a public forum. Funny thing about that, though, is that I would never say something that I couldn't actually state in a public forum in any other place. So I'm very cautious and very cognizant of what I say and do on this program because of the fact that it could be misconstrued, it could be taken out of context. And I want to make absolutely certain that what I am telling you is what I believe and in terms of my opinion, but also when I state facts and things like that, that I'm getting them from fairly reliable sources to the point where I know that the source is not incorrect. Okay. So, the censorship or the pseudo censorship, let's say, that's going on right now with the White House now saying that they are watching over social media and trying to get Facebook in particular proactive about what they consider misinformation, brings up the point, who figures out what is misinformation and what is not? An example of which, and this happened directly to me, there was a study that was put out by the Journal of American Medicine, JAMA, and they did I'm going to call it like a pseudo study. I mean, it wasn't necessarily like a full-blown scientific study, but they did a pseudo study on the effects of children wearing masks. And there was, what do I want to say? It was peer reviewed. It was posted in the JAMA article. And what it talked about is that the potential of a couple of things that could happen with kids wearing masks because of the fact that they are actually sucking in their own produced CO2 more often than not because of the mask covering, that there could be some potential health effects with that. And it was peer reviewed. It was publicized. It was put in the paper. Okay. The Journal of American Medicine. So, it went through all of the normal checks that pretty much anything else that gets published would. And by the way, them being a publisher, that means that if they misrepresent something, they can get sued, okay, because they are a publisher. So they don't get the same Section 230 protections that Facebook and Twitter get. So realistically, I went ahead and I posted that. And basically all I said is, look, I'm not a doctor. I don't know anything, but this does bring an interesting angle to the whole thing about kids wearing masks in schools. And my post got quote fact checked, and it was fact checked by and I don't remember who it was by, but it was fact checked. And that fact check basically kind of said that, oh, well, this isn't like a full blown study and so on and so forth. I mean, it was really, I'll be honest with you, it was kind of petty crap, if you ask me. But it was fact checked. And because it was fact checked, I probably have a strike on my record now, but because it was fact checked, people automatically would assume that because this thing was fact checked, that it would be, fake information or misinformation that's being put out there. When in actuality, it's gone through the same kind of the information has gone through the same kind of rigor that any other post or any other article that is part of the Journal of American Medicine would. And the funny thing about it is that we've got certain people, certain organizations, certain celebrities that are being watched specifically. And, the whole conspiracy theory around this is that conservatives are being censored. Well, I'm sorry, but the White House basically said that if you're spreading what they consider misinformation, they're going to contact Facebook and try to get your crap flagged. And so, that came out this week. And if you ask me, I mean, I've pretty much have already kind of known that we've been tracked and monitored. I mean, our communications, nothing is private. I did this under an episode called The Privacy Fallacy. Nothing is private really anymore in today's day and age. And so, other than what might be in your own mind, that's the only place that I would say that it probably is still pretty private. So the idea that we have, the White House now trying to pseudo censor speech in a way that they can't because they're protected by the First Amendment should be enough to get anybody, libertarians, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, anyone, it should give you pause because that brings about a potential of opening a Pandora's box toward totalitarianism. Now, another article that came out along these same lines was that I think the White House and Biden in particular was talking about censorship of texts. They actually wanted to censor our text going from one to the other. They wanted service providers to go ahead and do that. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, when you buy a contract, okay, when you buy a phone, if you own the phone outright, that's great. But the network that it's going on, that is owned by the company. And it is any service provider will tell you, they track that because they have to. They have to track it legally to try and track down things like child traffickers and, drugs, and criminal activity. But at the same time, in looking for that criminal activity, they also have to track and monitor you because they don't know who you are. And so, honestly, this is a conspiracy theory that's been running around for years. I mean, I heard back in, the early 90s that every single phone call is being recorded in under one of the government's secret locations and that. And then you have Eric Snowden and Julian Assange, both of them, they popped up all kinds of things through WikiLeaks and Eric Snowden saying that the NSA was spying on Americans, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, what this means is that we have, as of today, a serious breakdown in the government system. All of the systems that we normally have thought of as protections are starting to break down. And they are starting to disappear or not be enforced because you have things like the First Amendment, which should protect your speech, that is now, because the government can't do it, doesn't mean that private companies that you are essentially renting their space, even though social media, let's be honest, has become the de facto public square per se. Um, they are now looking to prevent and censor that information to come towards you. And they're doing it. I'll be honest with you. They may not be doing it intentionally this way. However, the thing about it is that because of the overwhelming distrust in the mainstream media today and everyone looking for alternative sources of information, there are so many different outlets that have gone through those sources of information, and all of those are now under attack too. So it basically gives the perception that the government is saying, well, if you don't listen to the stuff I approve, then you don't get to listen to anybody. And that honestly should cause people some pause. It really should. It should honestly scare you in a way, because now you need to understand that things are happening in terms of potential things like, let's just take it a step further into potential brainwashing. Now, speaking of brainwashing, here's another conspiracy theorist that's kind of been, or conspiracy theory that's been tossed around in the last couple of weeks. You have this whole thing called CRT, critical race training, okay, or critical race theory. But it's also been called several different other things, and it keeps changing its name and its purpose and function. But, whether you believe in it or not doesn't really make any difference. I mean, when I send my kids off to school, I expect them to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, maybe some world history, definitely American history, science, and the some of the major functions and knowledge that people need to have in order to move forward in life. I don't necessarily expect them to learn things about political viewpoints unless they happen to be in a political science class. Then it's totally acceptable. But to sit here and have teachers, especially teachers that are teaching subjects that are not part of things like teaching in subjects that aren't part of their curriculum. So they're a science teacher, but they're talking about, political agendas or something along those lines. That seems a little weird and a little odd. And the whole thing that they were talking about, here the government talked about CRT is not being, taught in schools, and CRT is only being taught at the level, at the university level and law schools. And so then you have the one of the biggest teachers unions across the country come out and basically say, if you're a teacher and you're teaching CRT and you're being, censored or whatever, we've got a legal issue. We've got a legal fund that we're setting aside to help defend you. And that by itself, that should be scary also, because how is it that the teachers union is basically putting together a fund, a legal fund, to defend against teachers who are teaching CRT or being accused of teaching CRT, and yet the government is saying, and everybody else is saying, no, CRT is not being taught in the high schools or in that level. Now, I understand going up to the university level, totally get it. The university level, you're an adult, you're supposed to explore different options. But again, going back to, elementary school and we've got, there's several videos that are out that are talking about teachers that are talking about CRT in classrooms in elementary schools. So how can you sit here and make the claim that it's not being taught when we have evidence being shown of it potentially being taught? Now, I'm not saying those videos are accurate or anything else. I'm not challenging the veracity of the videos. But again, it goes back to the whole point in the beginning, which is just the mere appearance of impropriety on these subjects is enough to cause Even just the average person should be enough to just cause the average person some level of distrust and concern in terms of what's going on. Now, I have a chat here that popped up in the YouTube chat, and the statement basically made is, no matter right or left, it seems like everything is headed toward a totalitarian state. The government will tell you what to think or say. And that's the fear. That, honestly, that is my fear. I mean, I am 100% to tell you, I'm not necessarily, I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist. I don't consider myself that way, even though I may present topics on this. It does bring up food for thought. It does bring up food for the brain to think about what's going on. And again, it doesn't seem to matter. And I'll be honest with you, this whole thing with the elections and with, CRT and all of this other stuff, I honestly don't think it necessarily falls within party lines specifically, because there are people in both parties that are looking to make specific changes to our government and the way that it runs and the way that it's handled. And me being a fairly strict constitutionalist, this causes some serious problems for me. And it should cause some questions for anyone. It doesn't matter who it is, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, doesn't make a difference. All of this stuff should give you at least alarm bells to make you think that, hey, maybe this is a problem. This is something that we need to fix. I mean, COVID came around. And again, I'm not going to argue. There is, several people have died from COVID. I know people who have lost people from COVID. Okay. COVID was a something that I think was a interesting thing to release on the world. And I'll get to that in just a second. But at the same time, though, we unfortunately gave up a certain amount of our freedoms. And we did it for the greater good, which honestly is kind of the whole point. I mean, that everybody did it for the greater good. But you have to ask yourself, at what point are these things going to get released? At what point are these things going to get backed off? Now, there are states in the nation that have backed off, that their governors have released their emergency powers. And then there's states like Michigan where Governor Whitmer, basically the legislature had to release the powers because the governor wasn't going to give them up. Or even here in the state of Washington, our governor has sort of kind of been like halfway. Like, well, okay, I'm going to open up the state, but at the same time, I'm not going to release my emergency powers. And again, whether his intentions are good or not makes no difference. The point is that these kinds of things make people mistrust and distrust the government and the government powers. I mean, we have the FBI. We have the IRS. I mean, even just in the last 20 years, the IRS has chased down people who were conservatives. The FBI has been going after and illegally spying on, a candidate. It's been proven 100% that he was spied on illegally. The FISA warrant that was pulled from a dossier that was paid for by the DNC, that's been proven. And yet there are still people out there who don't believe that don't believe that the FBI is actually part of this whole thing. And now you have, here's another one. There was a general, I can't think of his name right now, but he announced that he's got a book out. And in the book, he claims that Trump actually wanted to become the dictator. Whether he is or not, that's not the point of the conversation. But he's claiming in the book that Trump was looking to invoke the Insurrection Act and actually keep control and keep power. And according to that same individual, he was like, well, I'm not going to allow that to happen. And the CIA and the FBI and all of the people who have the guns, they're not going to allow it to happen either. Well, Thank you. Thank you. General Miley. Whether it happened or not, just the fact that we are at the point where somebody is even considering this is a bit of a problem. It's an entire issue. And, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I kind of agree with a lot of people. We should just clean house. We should clean out the entire house and start fresh. And by that, I mean, get rid of all of the people who are in top positions, and especially those who have been in government for a long time. I do think we need a constitutional amendment that limits the amount of time that congressmen and representatives can be within power, much like what we've done already for the president. I think that back when FDR was voted in 4 consecutive times to be the president, that tended to wake people up and scare people in the idea that somebody could have that kind of a following. And that did cause some pause and cause some concern. But I think now we need to carry it even further. I mean, if you think about this, Joe Biden has been in government for close to 45 years, I think, somewhere around there. Okay. Chuck Schumer, who was a senator, has been reelected multiple times to the point where he's been in back when Joe Biden was first elected. He's been in the government that long. Nancy Pelosi has been in that long. There was a Kennedy. I remember everybody kind of laughing at the whole, I think it was Senator Robert Kennedy. For a long time, people were laughing at him because he would come to Senate meetings and he'd fall asleep in his chair. And yet he still kept getting elected as a senator, even though he was obviously not fit for the position. And I think, unfortunately, when we're talking about conspiracy theories and stuff, it's things like that that make people kind of step back and take a second and go, you know what? What's really going on with our government? So, worn out Republicans. Well, I don't know any right off the top of my head. But I'm sure there's plenty of those in there. I mean, you've got Mitch McConnell as an example. He keeps getting elected. So Mitch McConnell's in there. He's the only one that I can think of right off the top of my head. But again, it doesn't matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans. I think it's just the whole idea from the constitutional standpoint, honestly, was not to make government your career. In fact, the idea was that from the founding fathers was that you would do your public service for a couple of years, maybe serve 1, possibly 2 terms, and then leave. And the idea was actually cemented in the standpoint of the initial thought process by George Washington, because George Washington was elected as president of the United States. He was elected a second term as president of the United States. They wanted him to run again, and he pretty much told them, no, I'm done. Somebody else needs to take the reins. I mean, that's paraphrasing, but that's basically what happened. And so this whole idea where people who are in the Senate and the House of Representatives for year upon year upon year, or election upon election upon election, is honestly our fault. It's our fault. But they're the ones that are causing a lot of the problems that we see in today's society. They're the ones that are causing a lot of the issues. And it's not that I'm saying that government is necessarily bad. It is bad now, but there are purposes and reasons for us to try and limit the amount of terms that somebody spends. And if you think about this, okay, you talk about how somebody can go into government. Here's a conspiracy theory for you. Somebody goes into government. And the most recent, couple of people that I can think of right off the top of my head, because they get in the news a lot, is past President Obama, and even now President Biden, and all of these, and the senator, a couple senators, the most notable ones are Bernie Sanders and Nancy Pelosi, just as names, not necessarily directly related with any political party. But all of those people have gone into government, and government honestly really doesn't have, you don't get paid a lot. I think for a starting junior senator or junior representative is like $175,000 a year. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to actually carry some of that and I guess pay some of your staff or something like that. I'm not 100% sure how that works, but I do know that their pay is relatively low in the grand scheme of things. So that being said, these people have gone into public service, and you're not supposed to go and get rich, but yet we have more millionaires in the Senate and the House of Representatives than we do in just the general public. And so you kind of have to wonder, where did all these people get this stuff? And it's sort of like the idea that, people, for an example, oh, trying to think, athletes don't necessarily make their money directly from the team. Most of their stuff comes from things like endorsements and endorsement deals and advertising deals and things like that. And so you got to kind of wonder, okay, if these people are not making money directly off the government, where is that money coming from? And it's those kinds of things that we need to take a look at. We need to check into. I mean, even you could even look at, there's claims Ivanka Trump and Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner. They all supposedly got rich. I haven't seen any of their tax returns, so I don't know. But there have been several reports that they received all kinds of money for the work that they were doing. You've got, Hunter Biden as a perfect example here recently. He's been accused of taking bribes and all kinds of stuff from companies that he has no business being a part of. But because of his connections, that's where he's getting the money. And so you have to kind of wonder, because that wasn't the intent. The intent was these people were supposed to go off to the government and run the government, and then come back to their businesses in order to and this is weird, but in order to take care of the government, they were only supposed to go there for a little while and then come back. Now, for those of you that are still listening, apparently my chat got disconnected for a second. That's what that was. The chat in the YouTube was the one that kind of threw me off. But anyway, so all of these things are conspiracy theories, supposedly conspiracy theories, that a lot of these things are starting to come out, that maybe there is some truth to some of this. And the last one that I have is actually kind of interesting. This one in particular has to deal with the Director of National Intelligence, the former Director of National Intelligence, and the recent report that came out. And I've mentioned it before, talking about UFOs. I mean, for how long conspiracy theorists have been talking about UFOs and talking about how they were aliens from space. And granted, the report that came out basically admitted that unidentified aerial vehicles, or it's not UAVs, but like UAPs, I think they call them, and UFOs, unidentified flying objects, are potentially real. They just have no explanation for them. They just don't know what they are. They know they're there. They've seen them. They've had multiple sensors. The John Ratcliffe admitted it and said, yeah, we've had several times where a unidentified flying object got picked up on multiple sensors and, was visually seen and so on and so forth. So they've at least gone and backed off the whole idea that, UFOs don't exist. They do exist. They just don't know what they are, and they're not willing to mention what they are. Now, interesting thought process was Dan Bongino did a whole segment on the UFOs thing, so I'm not even going to cover it close. But one of his contacts kind of made an interesting observation, and pretty much pulled out, hey, what do you think if it's some sort of test thing that we're doing, or that some other government is doing to mess with our sensors and everything else? They're basically creating this new technology. And that does make kind of an interesting point. I mean, if you think about it, way back in the day, when the whole, atomic bomb was created, that was brand new technology. And the whole idea of flying off into space in the 60s was brand new technology. And it sparked an entire genre of media with, Star Trek and Star Wars and all the different shows and things like that, Lost in Space, and I can think of, a couple others. But and then of course you had in the 80s, you were talking about stealth technology and special helicopters like with Airwolf, and then you have, kit. I mean, the internet itself that I'm coming to you on was the beginning of a project for the Defense Department. And so, it is entirely possible that these UFOs that people are seeing and people are, all these sensors are going off. It is entirely possible that they have some sort of an explanation, but they don't necessarily have the explanation that you think that they would. It may not necessarily be little green men, but at the same time, it may not necessarily not be little green men. So it's just kind of interesting that within the last several years, and by several years, I'm talking possibly 2 decades worth, we have had a potential release of a whole bunch of information with regards to conspiracy theories that have basically been floating around for years and never fully confirmed. And so, we're talking about election issues today. We're talking about the government watching our emails and watching our having the ability to watch our emails and tap into our texts and watch our social media. Now, social media, I mean, I understand that kind of makes sense. But especially when you make something public, that makes sense. But things like the government trying to track you, and you already are. I mean, like I said, the privacy fallacy, you should check that out. Check out that episode. None of this stuff really should cause anybody any surprise that they have these capabilities. But the fact that they are actually starting to admit them and admit to the American public that they not only have these capabilities, but that they're actually starting to use them for what would conceivably be nefarious purposes. That is something that should cause everyone some pause. That's my final Whiskey Musings thought for the evening. Do me a favor, if you like the show, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube. I'm also on Rumble, and I'm streaming on Spreaker directly, but you can also go back and listen to audio on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, and I guess GeoSavin. Never heard of it. But anyway, the main ones obviously are Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Google Podcasts. You can check out some of my old episodes. I'm trying to gradually add older episodes to that repertoire or that repository so people can actually go and listen to that. Otherwise, you guys have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next time on the Whiskey Musings broadcast. Good night.